All right, guys, welcome. We're going to talk about Emmaline Pankhurst and the radical feminist movement. If you look at this quote, this is from her daughter, really talking about the time of greatest humiliation is a moment when the spirit is the proudest. So this is the tactics they chose when trying to get the right to vote, which is what this feminist movement was all about. Now, Emmaline Pankhurst lived in Victorian England. She was a suffragette, which is someone who wants the right to vote, in this case, the woman's right to vote. And she was not the only suffragist out there, but she was known for being militant and aggressive. She formed an organization we'll get into with her daughters that really led the militant aspect of this suffrage movement. Even though they've had, people have not necessarily agreed with women's rights over the years, depending on who you are, how chauvinistic you are. I don't think anybody these days could say that women should not vote. And not always the case. The women in Great Britain did not get the right to vote till 1928, which is actually after Emmaline Pankhurst passed away. So Pankhurst's background, her dad was a manufacturer with radical sympathies. So again, radical, which is over on the far left. When she was a little girl, she read abolitionist materials like Uncle Tom's Cabin. She also took part in a lot of theater in her own home. They would act out things all the time, and that's how she became a very powerful public speaker, and some of the tactics she chose for her organization. Now, she married a lawyer in 1879 who was actually 20 years older than her. He was dedicated to her causes. They had 5 children. Unfortunately, 2 of her sons passed away, and then her husband died in 1898. And she was left with her 3 daughters and really no private means of money. So the family formed this kind of a cabal, a really powerful group. They founded the Women's Social and Political Union. This is super important. Put that in your notes. In 1903, this was the militant wing of the suffrage movement. The family divided up who did what well. Christabel, who was the eldest daughter, was the strategist. Sylvia, another daughter, was the artist, and so on. And they really formed a pretty powerful organization here. Now, it was a struggle. This movement we're talking about is really 1905 to 1914, which was the suffrage movement. This was all types of women from all classes were coming together, and this is in England. We're really looking at the Liberal government. This is the government that was in charge in the UK. It was the Liberal Party. They were the ones that were kind of in opposition for the feminist rights, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense if you think of what a liberal is. It's usually more freedom for people. So, again, she formed this Women's Social Political Union. They gained a lot of notoriety for their militant activities, violent. People were really freaked out by them. They would destroy windows, burn buildings down. They'd go on hunger strikes, in jail, and all this is for the right to vote. And in British society, women were not supposed to act like this. Women were supposed to be more docile, running the family, and suddenly you have these women smashing windows, doing hunger strikes. And in one extreme case in 1913, a member of the Women's Social Political Union threw herself in front of a horse at a major horse race in London. Obviously was killed in an attempt to gain notoriety for the cause. These women are very committed. Now, the police fell right into their hands. They would be violent, over the top with these women. Here's a guy. Look at her. She's actually picked up off the floor, carrying her off to jail. They were battered in demonstrations. They were actually, when they went on hunger strikes, they forcibly fed them in prison. A couple of them died. They would strap them down in this kind of a stretcher gurney thing, when they would jam a hose down their throat and pour liquid food in. It sometimes went down the trachea instead of the esophagus, and people choked to death. I mean, it was a really over the top, the police response, which again played right into the hands of the Pankhurst family. If you look at, again, the overall context here, if you look at Christabel, where peaceful means it failed. They tried to do nonviolent protests. One act of militancy really succeeded, and the newspapers paid attention to them. The newspapers could ignore people if they're just in some protest, but it's hard to ignore a woman throwing herself to her death in a horse race or smashing windows, and that's really why they took this violent approach. So one thing the authorities did to get people from dying of hunger strikes, they started this cat and mouse acts. So when women in jail went on a hunger strike and they were in danger of dying of starvation, they let them go. And when they became strong enough, they rearrested them. And it was this kind of yo-yo effect where they got released and arrested and got released and arrested. Miss Pankhurst herself, when she was 54 years old, 1912, not a young lady, went to prison 12 times in 1 year. So like once a month she was there. And one of her kind of claims, she would say, the militancy of men through the centuries has dressed the world in blood. When men are militaristic, you have war. The militancy of women harmed nobody except for those that fought this battle for what they believed in. Got to admire her. So the WSPU here, the organization, adopted these kind of French revolutionary crowd management. They were into spectacles and public ceremonies. When one of their members got released from prison, they would show up outside the jail in a wagon with flowers and all, draped up, and they would parade around the London and show her around. This kind of thing. And I mean, it was just kind of really in-your-face approach to how they operated. Now, people in the politicians, again, they did have no idea how to deal with these women. The women would sit there if a member of parliament was giving a speech to the public. They would have members of WSPU sitting there, and they would interrupt them, and they would mock them and yell stuff at them. And these are respectable-looking women in dress, like in Edwardian dress. And people, again, the politicians, all they had to do was give in, and they didn't. So what Pankhurst says, we want to help women gain all the rights and protections that law could give them. We want to get influence on society, but we can't do this unless we vote. They can't do that unless they're recognized as citizens and voices to be listened to. Her plea, another plea in court in 1912, she said, we're not here because we're lawbreakers. We're here in court because she got arrested because they want to become lawmakers. Again, they want the right to vote. And you really got to admire how she went about doing what she did. Confidence and really fortitude to keep going with this movement. So this period militancy actually ended abruptly when World War I began in 1914. To their credit, they realized that there was a bigger cause for humanity, and they took their efforts to supporting the war effort. In 1918, finally, women over 30 got the voting rights. Emmaline herself died in 1928, and shortly after that, women were granted equal voting rights with men at 21 years old. Lastly here, it really seems incredible that the West, slaves, ex-slaves got the right to vote before women. Really, in New Zealand, they were one of the first people. Women got the right to vote in 1893. Australia in 1902. And really, women in the U.S. 1920. So again, this suffrage movement, very interesting. The Pankhursts led the way.